In March 1943, a Norwegian commando named Jan Baalsrud found himself in an impossible situation. Separated from his team, barefoot in sub-zero temperatures, and hunted by hundreds of German soldiers, he faced the frozen wilderness of Arctic Norway with nothing but his will to survive. What followed was one of the most extraordinary escape stories of World War II, a 60-day ordeal that would push human endurance beyond imaginable limits. This is the story of Jan Baalsrud's incredible journey across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, and the Norwegian resistance fighters who risked everything to keep him alive. To understand Jan Baalsrud's story, we need to go back to the beginning of his fateful mission. Born in 1917 in Oslo, Baalsrud was working as an instrument maker when Nazi Germany invaded Norway in April 1940. Like many young Norwegians, he refused to accept the occupation of his homeland. He escaped to neutral Sweden, then made his way to Britain, where he joined the Norwegian Independent Company 1, also known as Kompaniling, an elite commando unit trained for sabotage and resistance operations. By early 1943, the war had reached a critical phase. The Allies needed intelligence networks in occupied Norway, and they needed brave men willing to risk everything to establish them. Baalsrud volunteered for Operation Martin, a mission to sabotage German air control installations in northern Norway and establish a base for resistance activities. On March 24, 1943, Baalsrud and 11 other Norwegian commandos set sail from the Shetland Islands aboard a fishing boat called the Bratholm. The vessel was disguised as a Swedish fishing trawler, and hidden beneath its deck were 8 tons of explosives, weapons, and equipment for the Norwegian resistance. Their destination was the Troms region of northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, a landscape of fjords, mountains, and frozen tundra where winter still held its iron grip. The mission was doomed from the start, though the men didn't know it yet. As the Bratholm approached the Norwegian coast near the island of Rebbenesoya, someone had already betrayed them. A local shopkeeper with Nazi sympathies had informed the Gestapo about suspicious activities in the area. On March 29, as the Bratholm anchored in Toftefjord, a German warship suddenly appeared. The Nazis had been waiting for them. What happened next was chaos. The Germans opened fire on the fishing boat, and the Norwegians scrambled to respond. In the confusion, Baalsrud and his companions tried to destroy the vessel and its cargo rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The Bratholm exploded in a massive fireball, the 8 tons of explosives detonating with devastating force. Of the 12 men on the mission, 11 were killed. Some in the initial firefight, others captured and later executed by the Gestapo. Jan Baalsrud was the only one who escaped. But his escape came at a terrible cost. In his desperate flight from the Germans, jumping into the freezing Arctic waters and scrambling onto the rocky shore, Baalsrud lost one of his boots. This might seem like a minor detail, but in the Arctic winter of northern Norway, it was potentially a death sentence. With temperatures well below freezing and his foot exposed to the elements, frostbite was inevitable. Baalsrud found himself alone on a barren snow-covered island, soaking wet, partially barefoot, and with the entire German garrison in the region now hunting for survivors. He had no food, no shelter, and no clear plan. The nearest neutral border, Sweden, was more than 200 kilometers away through some of the most inhospitable terrain in Europe. Between him and safety lay frozen mountains, deep snow, and hundreds of German soldiers. Most people would have surrendered or simply frozen to death that first night. Jan Baalsrud decided to fight. Baalsrud's immediate problem was survival. Wet clothes in Arctic temperatures meant hypothermia and death within hours. He needed shelter, warmth, and dry clothing. More importantly, he needed to evade the German search parties that were now scouring the area. For the first few days, Baalsrud hid in the rocky terrain around Toftefjord, moving only at night, trying to avoid detection. His missing boot became an increasingly serious problem. The exposed foot quickly developed frostbite, the tissue freezing and dying in the brutal cold. The pain was excruciating, but Baalsrud pressed on. He knew his only hope was to find help from the local population. This was an enormous risk. Northern Norway was occupied territory. and the Germans had informants everywhere. One wrong choice, one knock on the wrong door, and he would be captured, tortured, and executed. But without help, he would certainly die of exposure or starvation. Baalsrud made contact with a local family who, despite the terrible risks, agreed to help him. This was the first of many acts of extraordinary courage by Norwegian civilians who would risk their lives to save the stranger. The family gave him food, dry clothes, and shelter for a brief time. But the Germans were conducting house-to-house searches, and it was too dangerous for Baalsrud to stay in any one place for long. Word began to spread through the resistance network. A survivor from the Brat home was on the run and needed help. Local resistance members began organizing, creating a secret chain of safe houses and guides who would help Baalsrud move toward the Swedish border. But moving him would be incredibly difficult. By now, his frostbitten foot was turning gangrenous, and he could barely walk. As the German search intensified, the local resistance made a difficult decision. Baalsrud could not keep moving from house to house. It was too dangerous for everyone involved. Instead, they would hide him in a snow cave on a remote mountainside called Revdal, while they worked out a plan to smuggle him across the border into Sweden. For 27 days, Jan Baalsrud lived alone in that snow cave. Imagine that for a moment. Nearly a month, buried in snow, in temperatures that often dropped to -20 degrees Celsius or lower. His frostbitten foot was now severely infected, swollen and blackened with gangrene. He had a sleeping bag and whatever food the resistance members could bring him when they dared to visit, but most of the time, he was utterly alone in the darkness. During this period, Baalsrud faced not just physical challenges but psychological ones. The isolation, the constant pain, the uncertainty of whether rescue would ever come, all of this wore on his mental state. He later described having conversations with imaginary companions and hallucinations brought on by pain, cold, and hunger. But he never gave up. Even as his foot deteriorated, even as he grew weaker, Baalsrud maintained his will to survive. He knew that Norwegian resistance fighters were risking their lives for him, and he was determined not to let their sacrifices be in vain. Meanwhile, the local resistance was working desperately to find a way to move him. The original plan to ski him across the mountains to Sweden had become impossible. Baalsrud was too weak and his foot too damaged for him to ski. They needed a new plan, and time was running out. The gangrene was spreading, and if Baalsrud didn't receive proper medical attention soon, he would die. After 27 days in the snow cave, Baalsrud was finally moved to a different location, a small cabin where he could receive more direct help. But by this point, his condition had deteriorated dramatically. The gangrene in his foot had spread up his leg, and the infection was threatening his life. Something had to be done, or he would die within days. The local resistance contacted the few people in the area with any medical knowledge. What they decided to do next is almost unbelievable. Without proper surgical tools, without anesthesia, and without any formal surgical training, they decided to amputate Baalsrud's toes to stop the spread of gangrene. Using a pocket knife and a pair of pliers, Jan Baalsrud, with guidance from a resistance member who had some medical knowledge, amputated 9 of his own toes. Let that sink in for a moment. In a remote cabin in Arctic Norway, with German soldiers still searching for him, this man performed surgery on himself with improvised tools, knowing that it was his only chance at survival. The amputation was crude and agonizingly painful, but it worked. The removal of the gangrenous tissue prevented the infection from spreading further up his leg. Baalsrud's incredible willpower and pain tolerance had, once again, kept him alive. But he was now even more debilitated, and the journey to Sweden seemed more impossible than ever. By late May 1943, nearly 2 months after the Bratholm disaster, the Norwegian resistance had finalized a plan to get Baalsrud across the border. A team of resistance fighters would transport him on a sled across the mountains to the Swedish border, a journey of more than 100 kilometers through some of the most challenging terrain imaginable. This wasn't simply a matter of pulling a sled through snow. The route crossed high mountain plateaus where avalanches were a constant danger, where whiteout conditions could strike without warning, and where temperatures could kill an exposed person in minutes. The resistance fighters who volunteered for this mission knew they might not return. The journey took several days, with the team pulling Baalsrud on a sled and, when the terrain became too difficult, carrying him on their backs. They traveled mostly at night to avoid German patrols, navigating by stars and landmarks in the perpetual twilight of the Arctic spring. Baalsrud was often unconscious or delirious from pain and fever, but the team pressed on. They faced multiple close calls with German patrols. At one point, they had to hide Baalsrud under snow while soldiers passed nearby. Another time, an avalanche nearly buried the entire group. But the resistance fighters were determined. They had come too far, and Baalsrud had suffered too much, for them to fail now. Finally, on May 30th, 1943, 62 days after the Bradholm disaster, Jan Baalsrud crossed the border into Sweden. He was barely alive, weighing less than 80 pounds, missing 9 toes, and suffering from severe frostbite, malnutrition, and infection. But he was alive and he was free. Baalsrud was immediately hospitalized in Sweden, where he spent months recovering from his ordeal. Doctors marveled that he had survived at all. The combination of exposure, starvation, untreated wounds, and infection should have killed him many times over. His survival was attributed to a combination of incredible physical resilience, mental toughness, and the selfless actions of dozens of Norwegian resistance fighters. After recovering, Baalsrud returned to Britain and continued to serve with the Norwegian forces for the remainder of the war. He participated in several more operations, though none as harrowing as his 1943 escape. After the war, he returned to Norway and lived a relatively quiet life, working and eventually settling in northern Norway, the same region where he had nearly died. The story of Jan Baalsrud's escape became legendary in Norway. It exemplifies the courage and sacrifice of the Norwegian resistance during World War II. At least 12 Norwegians directly risked their lives to help Baalsrud escape, and dozens more provided assistance in smaller ways. Several of these helpers were later captured by the Gestapo and faced imprisonment, torture, or execution because of their actions. Baalsrud himself rarely spoke publicly about his ordeal, preferring to honor the memory of his fallen comrades and the resistance fighters who saved him. But his story was documented in the book We Die Alone by David Howarth, published in 1955, which brought international attention to his incredible survival tale. Jan Baalsrud's escape across frozen Norway is more than just an adventure story or a tale of survival. It's a profound lesson in human resilience, the power of community, and the strength of the human spirit when confronted with seemingly impossible odds. First, it demonstrates what humans are capable of when survival depends on it. Baalsrud endured cold, hunger, pain, and isolation that would break most people. He performed self-amputation without anesthesia. He survived for weeks in conditions that should have killed him within hours. His story expands our understanding of human endurance. Second, it highlights the incredible courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Norwegian resistance members who helped Baalsrud were not soldiers or trained operatives. They were fishermen, farmers, shopkeepers, and families. Yet they risked torture and death to help a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Their actions remind us that heroism often comes from unexpected places. Third, Baalsrud's story illustrates the importance of never giving up, even when all hope seems lost. Time and again during his ordeal, Baalsrud faced situations where surrender or death seemed inevitable. Yet he kept fighting, kept enduring, and ultimately survived. His determination is a powerful reminder that the human will to survive can overcome almost any obstacle. Today, there are memorials in northern Norway commemorating Jan Baalsrud's incredible journey and the resistance fighters who helped him. Visitors can hike parts of the route he took, though in far more comfortable conditions than Baalsrud experienced. The story has been retold in documentaries and films, including the 2017 Norwegian film, The 12th Man, which brought renewed attention to this remarkable tale. Jan Baalsrud passed away in 1988 at the age of 71, having lived a full life after his wartime ordeal. He remained humble about his experience, always insisting that the true heroes were the Norwegians who risked everything to save him and the 11 comrades who died in the Bratholm disaster. His story endures because it represents something fundamental about the human experience: our capacity for endurance, our willingness to help others at great personal cost, and our refusal to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the frozen wilderness of northern Norway in 1943, Jan Baalsrud proved that the human spirit, when tested to its absolute limits, can achieve the seemingly impossible. When we face our own challenges, when life seems overwhelming and the path forward unclear, we might remember the man who crawled across frozen mountains with 9 fewer toes, sustained by the kindness of strangers and an unbreakable will to survive. If Jan Baalsrud could endure that, perhaps we can face our own difficulties with similar courage and determination.